My brother didn't just try to steal my mother's farmhouse on the day of her funeral. He actually succeeded for a little while, forging a deed that transferred the whole thing to him for $1, and on my 60th birthday he had a sheriff's deputy escort me off the 10 acres I had tended for 35 years. Today, that same farmhouse is still standing, and my brother lives in it as my tenant, paying me a triple net lease that goes up precisely 17% every time he complains about the terms, which he does almost weekly because he can't help himself. And right out front, next to the sign for my little farm-to-table bed and breakfast, there is a smaller permanent plaque that lists his criminal restitution case number for every guest to see. My B&B is called the Forged Acre, and business has never been better. It all started unraveling the afternoon my mother passed, and if you want to understand just how perfectly I was underestimated, you need to know the kind of woman I was before any of this happened. I am Ruth Haywood, and for most of my adult life people in our small Ohio town knew me as the quiet sister who stayed. I was 22 and fresh out of a bookkeeping job at a title company over in Mansfield when my mother broke her hip and needed someone to manage the farm full-time. My brother David was already 25 and climbing the ladder at a commercial real estate firm in Columbus, too important to come home for more than Thanksgiving and an occasional Easter if there wasn't a golf outing. So I moved back into the farmhouse, took over the vegetable plots and the berry patches and the half-acre market garden, and I learned how to keep the place alive. By the time I turned 40, I had given up any chance of a separate career. I was the one who took Mom to chemo when the breast cancer came the first time, and when it returned 5 years later and spread to her lungs, I was the one who slept on a cot in her room so she wouldn't wake up alone in the dark. David sent text messages and had his assistant wire flowers. That was the shape of our family, and I accepted it. The one detail from those years that would later turn out to be a sword in my hand was this. Before I left that title company, I had spent 3 years auditing property records, verifying chain of title, and spotting deed irregularities. I could tell a quitclaim deed from a warranty deed in my sleep, and I knew exactly how a county recorder's stamp was supposed to look, down to the ink color and the embossment depth. That knowledge sat dormant for decades, like a seed waiting for rain. I also had a small set of lockpicking skills, taught to me by an elderly neighbor named Mr. Clemens who kept locking himself out of his house. He showed me how to use a tension wrench and a rake pick on a standard Schlage deadbolt, and for years I carried those slim little tools in my wallet because they reminded me of his kindness. I never imagined I would need them against my own flesh and blood. My mother died at home on a Tuesday in early May, holding my hand while the morning light came through the kitchen door. I called David right away, and by that evening his silver Mercedes was parked in the gravel drive with his wife Caroline in the passenger seat, her designer sunglasses still on her face like she was attending an outdoor wine tasting rather than arriving at a house where someone had just died. They swept in with a casserole they had picked up at a grocery store deli, and a lot of talk about handling things so I wouldn't have to worry. I was so hollowed out with grief, I barely registered the weirdness of their efficiency. They hadn't even looked at Mom's body before David was already asking where she kept the deed to the property. That night I sat in my mother's bedroom trying to gather her things, and in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, under a stack of old Kleenex boxes and a tattered Bible, I found a small wooden box with a brass clasp. It was about the size of a shoe box, unvarnished, the kind of thing you buy at a craft fair. I carried it into the living room where David and Caroline were talking in low voices. Caroline saw it and wrinkled her nose. David barely glanced up. That old junk box, Mom had it for years, probably just buttons and expired coupons. Toss it, he waved a hand. We've got real decisions to make, Ruth. You need to take it easy and let us handle everything. I nodded and said I'd throw it out. Instead, I took it back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Inside were a few faded photographs of Mom as a girl, a lock of my baby hair tied with a ribbon, and a small spiral notebook with a cardboard cover. The pages were blank except for the last one. In my mother's handwriting, shaky and thin but unmistakably hers, there was a sentence written in blue ballpoint that made my hands start to tremble. Ruth, they are not what they pretend. David has debts you can't imagine. He will try to take the farm. Do not trust them, save yourself. I read it 6 times. The ink was smudged in places as if she had cried while writing it, and the paper was curled from being held. She had known. She had left me this warning like a flare sent up in the dark, and I had almost missed it because David told me it was junk. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that real family is not built on blood, but on who shows up when it counts and fights to protect what's right. That belief is what kept me going through everything that came next. The day after the funeral, David and Caroline cornered me in the kitchen. Caroline was wearing a silk blouse and pearls, and she kept patting my hand like I was a confused elderly relative she needed to manage. David had a manila folder open on the table, and he slid a stack of papers toward me with a pen on top. "Look, Ruth, I know this is a lot, but we talked about this months ago, remember? You agreed it made sense for me to take over the property. It's too much for you alone, and frankly the place needs a lot of investment. I can develop it, bring in some real income. All you have to do is sign this deed transfer and it's done. I'll even let you stay in the cottage as long as you want, rent-free. It's what Mom would have wanted." I had never agreed to any such thing. The last time I had spoken to my brother about the farm before Mom died was 3 years earlier, when he'd suggested we sell it and split the money, and I'd told him absolutely not. But I saw the shape of what he was doing. He was banking on my grief, on my exhaustion, on the years of conditioning that taught me to defer to him because he was the successful one, the golden child who always had a plan. He expected me to be foggy and compliant, and I was foggy. My mother's notebook was hidden under my mattress, and her warning was the only thing keeping a small pilot light burning in my mind. I looked at the papers. They were a quitclaim deed, transferring all interest in the property from me to him for the stated consideration of $1. He had already filled in his name as the grantee. The grantor line was blank, waiting for my signature. A notary block was pre-filled with a stamp I didn't recognize. The notary's name was listed as Linda P. Holloway, but the commission expiration date was from a year in the future, which is impossible for a notary stamp because commissions expire on specific dates and you never post-date them. I spotted that instantly. The paper also had a faint photocopy grain, and the notary seal wasn't embossed at all. I knew right then that the whole document was a fabrication. I swallowed hard and let my voice come out thin and hesitant, the way someone might sound after a minor stroke. "David, I just don't feel ready to sign anything right now. I'm having trouble remembering things. Can I have a little time? I keep mixing up dates and I can't even remember where I put my spare house key." I let my eyes drift a little, unfocusing. He exchanged a glance with Caroline and I saw something flicker between them. Irritation, quickly masked, and then something colder, opportunity. "Of course," Caroline cooed. "You've been through so much. Why don't you come stay with us in the city for a bit? Just to rest and get your bearings. We have a guest suite. We can handle the estate from there and you won't have to be alone in this big empty house." I understood immediately. They wanted me away from the farm, away from any neighbors who might talk to me, away from any paperwork or property records I might stumble across. They wanted me contained, and something told me that if I refused they'd find a way to force it. So I played the part of the bewildered older sister who just needed a helping hand. I said yes. I packed a single suitcase, and I slipped the notebook into a hidden pocket inside the lining. I also took the stack of papers David had tried to make me sign, tucking them into a folder of keepsakes I said I couldn't leave behind. I made a show of being slow and forgetful, asking the same questions twice, so that by the time we left, David was practically patting himself on the back. He thought he had a confused old woman in his pocket. Their guest suite turned out to be a windowless basement room that had previously been a storage closet. There was a pull-out sofa, a standing lamp, and a bathroom down the hall. Caroline apologized that the real guest room was being remodeled, but I didn't miss the deadbolt on the door that locked from the outside. They weren't even trying to be subtle. The first night, I lay on that thin mattress and listened to their muffled conversation through the vent. I caught phrases like power of attorney and competency evaluation, and we just need her signature once. They were plotting to have me declared unfit so David could act as my legal guardian. My mother's warning burned in my chest. For the first 2 weeks I did nothing but watch and listen. I shuffled around the house in slippers, sipping tea, pretending to nap a lot. I would sit on the sofa in their living room with a blank stare, and after a while they stopped lowering their voices around me. David held loud phone calls in his study, thinking I couldn't hear through the vents. I sat in the laundry room next to the ductwork and memorized every word. He was talking to someone about a bridge loan and a balloon payment and begging for an extension. He used words like collateral and foreclosure, and his voice got shrill when he thought no one was listening. One afternoon I heard him screaming into the phone, "I told you the old lady has the deed, but she's not going to be a problem. I've got her right where I need her. Just give me 60 days. The person on the other end must have demanded something because David slammed the receiver down and I heard him pacing in a frantic loop. I wrote down the time and every word I could catch, building a mental ledger of his desperation. Caroline, meanwhile, was spending money as if they had unlimited credit. I saw packages arrive daily, unmarked boxes and bags from high-end stores. She'd put them in the trunk of her car and drive off, probably returning them or hiding them from David. I once overheard her hissing at him about keeping up appearances. "And you said this would be easy, David. You said we'd have the cash by now." The whole house felt like a pressure cooker, and I was the mouse in the corner taking notes. Then came the accident that changed everything. One afternoon, a pipe under the kitchen sink burst. Water was gushing everywhere, and Caroline shrieked for me to do something while David was out. I turned off the main valve under the sink, pulled out my old pocket multi-tool I'd carried since my farm days, and had the pipe coupler replaced with a temporary patch in 20 minutes. Caroline stared at me with something new in her eyes, not quite respect, more like calculation, a belated realization that I wasn't entirely useless. That moment gave me a small opening. I started fixing small things around the house, a jammed garbage disposal, a loose stair tread, a sticky lock on the back door. I played it off as a way to earn my keep, but what I was really doing was mapping the house and building a baseline of how David and Caroline responded when I was in certain places. The locked office at the end of the hallway was my real target. David always kept the key on a ring in his pocket, but the lock itself was a standard Schlage deadbolt, the kind I had learned to manipulate from Mr. Clemens. I had kept the tension wrench and rake pick in my wallet for decades, and now I slipped them into the hem of my nightgown for easy access. One Tuesday David left early for a meeting, and Caroline was at a luncheon. I had the house to myself. I went to the office door, knelt down, and with the practiced movements of someone who'd opened 100 sticky filing cabinets at the title company, I had that deadbolt turned in under 90 seconds. The door swung open, and I stepped into the belly of the beast. The office was a mess of bankers' boxes, filing cabinets, and a desk covered in stacks of paper. A shredder sat in the corner, its bin overflowing. I started with the filing cabinet. The top drawer was labeled Real Estate Transactions, and inside I found a folder with my name on it. That took my breath away. Inside were dozens of documents, a fully executed quitclaim deed, complete with a notary stamp and my supposed signature, transferring the farm to David for $1. The notary stamp was from a county I'd never been to, and the notary's name was smudged, but when I held it up to the light I could see the seal wasn't embossed, it was just a photocopy. A real notary stamp in Ohio has a raised embossment, and the ink color must match state specifications. This was a lazy, digital fake. I took a picture with my phone, a cheap burner phone I'd bought with cash the week before, knowing my regular cell was probably being monitored. Then I found a second document, a limited power of attorney that David had already signed on my behalf, with my forged signature authorizing him to encumber the property. The notarization on that one was also fake, and the date was 3 days before my mother died, which meant the fraud had started while she was still alive. I dug deeper. A loan application from a regional bank, listing the farmhouse and 10 acres as collateral, claiming a value of $500,000. The application had my name as a co-applicant, forging my signature again. I was supposedly guaranteeing the debt. A promissory note, a deed of trust, a personal financial statement. Spread throughout the folder were receipts and emails that showed David had been planning to take over the property for months before Mom even died. He'd even had an appraisal conducted while she was on her deathbed. The appraiser's name was listed as a man who had lost his license 2 years prior for inflating values, a fact I only knew because the title company had flagged him in a bulletin years ago. David was so sloppy it was almost insulting. The shredded bin was next. I don't know if you've ever spent 40 minutes reassembling cross-cut shredder confetti on a dusty floor while your heart pounds and your ears strain for the sound of a garage door, but I did exactly that. Piece by piece, I rebuilt 6 pages of a communication between David and a man named Gino who appeared to be a loan shark. The language was blunt. David owed Gino $180,000 from a botched development deal, and interest was accruing at 5% a week. If he didn't pay, there were threats of consequences, including phrases like "your wife's car might have an accident, and we know where your sister lives." My hands started shaking so hard I had to stop and take deep breaths. I was not just a pawn in a real estate scheme, I was collateral for a violent debt. I photographed everything, every document, every envelope, every sticky note. Then I carefully restored the room to exactly how I'd found it, locking the door behind me and retreating to my basement room to think. That night, I lay on the pull-out sofa and stared at the ceiling, running through everything I knew. David was a competent real estate professional but arrogant. He had forged multiple documents, but he'd done it sloppily because he assumed the only person who might look closely was me, and he assumed I was too ignorant to spot the problems. He'd used a digital notary stamp. He'd spelled the county recorder's name wrong on one photocopied page. It said Morgan Country instead of Morgan County. That kind of typo would never appear on an official document, and he had likely never even checked the actual title status of the property itself. That last part was the magical detail. When I was working at the title company, one of my jobs had been to pull the chain of title for every property we insured. I knew that a property's recorded documents told a story that most people never read. I had a faint memory of my mother saying something about seeing a lawyer a few years back, after a boundary dispute with a neighbor, but I hadn't thought much of it. If she had done something to protect the farm, it would be recorded at the county recorder's office. I needed to get to a computer where I could access the online public records portal, and I needed to do it without David knowing. The opportunity came 3 days later. Caroline asked me to accompany her to the county library because she needed to check out a book club selection and wanted company. I said yes and brought my own library card, which I'd had for years, along with a small notebook and pen. At the library, while Caroline perused fiction, I sat at a public computer, logged onto the county recorder's website, and searched for our property parcel number. I pulled up every document recorded in the last decade. There, filed 2 years before my mother's death, was a document I had never seen, a declaration of trust and a recorded memorandum of trust, establishing the farm in an irrevocable trust with my mother as the original trustee. But the trust document itself contained a specific provision. Upon my mother's death or incapacity, the farm would pass to me as beneficiary trustee, and any transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the property would require the joint approval of a third-party co-trustee, a neutral attorney named Mr. Alastair Harrison, whose signature must be witnessed and notarized in his physical presence. The trust explicitly stated that no deed or deed of trust would be valid without Mr. Harrison's direct participation, and that any attempt to convey the property without his notarized consent would be null and void. It was a dead man's switch, and my mother had set it up with the precision of a chess master. She had known David would try something, and she had made it legally impossible for him to succeed without my willing cooperation and Mr. Harrison's oversight. The document even included a clause that if I were ever deemed incapacitated, Mr. Harrison would step in as interim co-trustee to protect the property. My mother had covered every angle. I printed the trust documents discreetly, folded them into my purse, and found Caroline by the large print section where she was on her phone ignoring the books. I smiled weakly and said I'd had a nice walk. She didn't suspect a thing. That evening I made the first call I'd placed in weeks from a payphone at a gas station a mile from their house using a prepaid calling card. I dialed Mr. Harrison's law office. He answered on the second ring. When I told him who I was, there was a long pause and then a quiet, grave voice. "MS. Haywood, I've been expecting your call. Your mother hoped you'd never need me, but she prepared for it. Tell me what's happening." I told him everything. David's forged deed, the loan applications, the false signatures, the basement room, the threats from the loan shark. Mr. Harrison listened without interruption, then said, "It's worse than you think. I've been monitoring the county recorder filings as part of my duties as co-trustee. Your brother actually recorded that forged quitclaim deed 3 days ago, and I've already filed a notice of defect with the recorder's office to cloud the title. He thinks it's clean. He's scheduled to close on a $400,000 loan at a title agency in town next Friday, using the farm as collateral. The lender believes you are a willing co-signer because David submitted that fake power of attorney. If we can catch him presenting a fraudulent deed at closing, we can bring in the authorities mid-transaction. The fraud division of the county prosecutor's office has been interested in David Haywood for some time. He's been flagged for suspicious flipping schemes in Columbus. I've already been in touch with a detective. Can you help me gather the final nail?" I said yes without hesitation. Mr. Harrison explained that the plan required me to attend the closing as if I were the confused sister, to let David present the forged documents, and then to refuse to sign and call him out. A detective would be waiting in the building, and the title agency would be notified in advance. I would need to play my role perfectly until then, not raising any suspicion. He also gave me the name of the title agent, Sheila, and told me she was already cooperating. Sheila would ensure the loan closing documents were on the table, complete with the fraudulent deed of trust, so that the evidence would be right there when the detective walked in. Over the next week, I continued my act. I let David believe I was becoming more confused. I intentionally left a kettle boiling until it whistled for 10 minutes, and I asked the same question about dinner 3 times in a row. David and Caroline exchanged looks of triumph. On Wednesday, 2 days before the closing, David brought home a document I instantly recognized, a medical affidavit from a doctor I'd never met, declaring me incompetent and appointing David as my legal guardian. He had forged the doctor's signature too. He didn't show it to me, but I saw it on his desk when he left the office door ajar. I photographed it through the gap with my burner phone. The audacity was breathtaking, but I kept my face slack and my eyes distant. Before the trap could spring, I decided I needed to see exactly how much humanity was left in my brother. I staged a test. It was Thursday evening, the night before the closing. I was in the kitchen helping Caroline set the table. David was in the living room, on the phone with someone, his voice tight. I had filled a heavy ceramic casserole dish with water to make it heavier, and as I walked toward the dining area, I let myself collapse hard. The dish shattered on the tile floor, water splashing everywhere, and I went down with a real thud that knocked the breath out of me. I clutched my chest, breathing in short, dramatic gasps, letting my eyelids flutter open and shut. Caroline screamed. David looked up from his phone call, saw me on the ground, and did something I'll never forget. He didn't move toward me. He didn't call 911. He looked at the coffee table where a manila envelope containing the final loan documents was sitting, and he walked over me. I felt his shoe brush my outstretched leg as he stepped across my body to grab that envelope. He held it to his chest like a baby, then said to Caroline, "Call 911 if you want, but let me get this locked in the car first." He walked out. I lay there on the cold tile, perfectly fine but shaking inside, while Caroline dialed with trembling fingers and finally came to kneel beside me. When David came back a minute later, I was already sitting up, saying it was a dizzy spell, maybe low blood sugar. His face was blank. He said, "Glad you're okay, we can't afford any delays tomorrow." Then he walked back to his study. That was the moment my last atom of family loyalty evaporated. I was not his sister. I was an obstacle. The day of the closing arrived. David was practically vibrating with nervous excitement. He told me we were going to sign some paperwork to finalize the estate, and that if I cooperated, I'd never have to worry about money again. Caroline dressed me in a nice blouse and told me I looked lovely, like she was dressing a doll for a parade. We drove to the title agency, a brick building on the edge of town. Inside, a conference room had been set up with water bottles and a notary seal. The lender's representative, a bored-looking man in a tie, waited with a stack of documents. The title agent, a woman named Sheila Lopez, was busy organizing papers. She gave me a brief, knowing look that no one else caught. David ushered me to a chair and slid the closing papers toward me, his pen already uncapped. "Just here, Ruth. Initial here and sign at the bottom. It's all the same stuff we talked about. You're doing the right thing for the family." I looked at the documents. There was the deed of trust, the promissory note, the settlement statement. My forged signature was already on some of them, but the final signature blocks were blank, waiting for my pen. I picked it up. David was smiling. Caroline was leaning forward, her hands clasped. The notary, a woman David had arranged, was already reaching for her stamp. Sheila was standing by the door, her hand near the handle. I set the pen down. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. I looked at David and I said, as calmly as if I were asking about the weather, "I am not signing any of these papers, David. That deed of trust is a worthless attempt to encumber a property you don't own and never will, because the real title is in an irrevocable trust that requires 2 co-trustee signatures. Your forged quitclaim deed is a felony, and so is the power of attorney you fabricated to impersonate me. You thought I was just the older sister who planted tomatoes, but I spent my 20s auditing title chains, and I know a fake notary stamp when I see one. You made at least 6 separate errors that would get you laughed out of any title insurance underwriter's office. The notary's commission was post-dated, the county name is spelled wrong on one page, the seal has no embossment, and that medical affidavit you tried to slide in. I have a photograph of it, and I have the doctor's office on record saying they never saw me. You are not taking my home." David's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the conference room door opened and 3 people walked in. Mr. Harrison in a grey suit, a county sheriff's detective in plainclothes, and a woman from the prosecutor's fraud division carrying a folder full of my evidence. The detective said David Haywood was under arrest for forgery, identity theft, fraud, attempted grand theft, and elder abuse. He was read his rights. Caroline started screaming that they hadn't done anything, but the detective calmly informed her she was also a person of interest in the conspiracy. The lender's representative looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The notary was taken aside for questioning about her own role in the scheme. As David was being handcuffed, he turned to me and snarled, "You couldn't have done this alone. You're not that smart. You've been faking this whole time." I looked back at the man I'd once called my brother and said, "Smart enough to outlast a man who can't even spell the county he's stealing from. Mom saw you coming, David. She built a better cage than you ever could." The detective led him out and I walked over to Mr. Harrison and shook his hand. Sheila gave me a discreet thumbs up and I felt a wave of exhaustion crash over me. But it was the good kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes after you finish a job. The aftermath was a slow burn of justice that I savored in real time. David was charged with 5 felonies. The forensic accountant who examined his dealings discovered a web of fraudulent real estate transactions stretching back 7 years, including multiple cases of elder financial abuse where he'd targeted widowed homeowners in the Columbus area and persuaded them to sign over their homes. His real estate license was revoked permanently, and the state attorney general opened an investigation into his firm. Caroline filed for divorce within a week, taking what little wasn't seized and moving to Florida under a cloud of her own suspicion. She was never charged, but the social fallout was enough to drive her out of town. David spent 14 months in county lockup before taking a plea deal. The court required full financial restitution, including paying me back for the time he had illegally occupied the farmhouse while I was locked in his basement, plus punitive damages for emotional distress. They appointed a receiver to liquidate his remaining assets, which covered part of it, but there was still a large monthly payment he owed me directly. The criminal restitution order was permanent, and it would follow him for the rest of his life unless he paid every cent. That case number, 21CR0934, became a string of digits I would never forget. During the criminal process, the farmhouse sat empty while I moved back into the old cottage on the property. It was a small 2-bedroom building that had once housed farmhands, with a sagging porch and a roof that needed patching, but it was mine. I used part of the early restitution payments to renovate the cottage and prepare the big farmhouse for a new purpose. Mr. Harrison helped me navigate the trust terms so that I could lease the farmhouse as a separate property without violating the trust's protections. When David was released on probation, he was broke, unemployed, and unhireable in any field involving finance or real estate. His fancy car was gone, his credit was destroyed, and he had nowhere to live. His probation officer contacted me to ask if I had any suggestions for housing. I had already consulted with Mr. Harrison about legal language, and I made an offer that sounded generous but was entirely self-serving. I would lease the farmhouse to David under a triple net lease. For those who don't know, a triple net lease means the tenant pays all property taxes, all insurance, and all maintenance costs on top of a base rent. The tenant is responsible for everything from a leaky faucet to a new roof. I set the base rent at a fair market rate, which I calculated by getting 3 independent appraisals and taking the highest one. David had no choice but to accept, but here was the beautiful part. I had Mr. Harrison draft a clause that I call the complaint escalator. It stated that for every documented instance in which the tenant, David, filed a frivolous complaint with any regulatory agency, or sent any harassing communication to the landlord, or verbally accosted the landlord regarding the terms of the lease, the monthly rent would increase by 17%, compounding annually. 17% for each incident. The first month he lived there, he called me to complain about the drafty windows in the living room, a window I had personally replaced 5 years earlier. I sent him a certified letter documenting the complaint, and his next month's rent rose accordingly. He complained again about the gravel driveway. I documented it. Another 17%. By month 6 he was paying almost double what he'd started with. He learned to keep his mouth shut mostly, but that simmering resentment meant he still slipped up often enough that my income from that lease alone funded the B&B renovation, without a single penny of debt. Meanwhile, I opened the Forged Acre bed and breakfast in the cottage. With a farm-to-table breakfast featuring produce from the gardens I replanted that spring, heirloom tomatoes, 3 kinds of squash, a strawberry patch, a dozen raised beds that guests can walk through and pick their own garnishes. The cottage has 3 guest rooms, each named after a variety of rose my mother used to grow, Peace, Queen Elizabeth, and Mr. Lincoln. In the front yard, right where the driveway splits toward the farmhouse and the cottage, I installed 2 signs. One is a hand-painted wooden sign that says the Forged Acre B&B established in truth. The other is a smaller metal plaque professionally engraved that reads, "This property subject to case No. 21CR0934, State v. David Allen Haywood. Forgery, identity fraud. Theft, I check it every morning to make sure it hasn't been removed, because the lease on the farmhouse explicitly prohibits the tenant from approaching or altering that part of the property, and a violation triggers an immediate eviction with no grace period. My guests love the story. I don't hide it. I tell them over breakfast, with the fresh eggs and the sourdough biscuits, exactly what my brother tried to do and how my mother saw it coming years before she died. I show them the notebook page I had framed in the kitchen. The warning is there for everyone to read. Do not trust them, save yourself. People often ask if I ever feel guilty, making my own brother pay me to live in the house he tried to steal. I tell them no. I tell them guilt is a tool that people like David used to keep quiet people quiet. My mother taught me better, and so did the legal system. Every month when his rent check clears, I put a portion into a college fund for the children of those widowed homeowners he defrauded. The rest goes right back into the farm, into the soil he thought he could pave over with some soulless development. The gardens are thriving, the chickens are laying, and the B&B has a waiting list 6 months long. Not bad for the quiet sister who stayed. I think about my mother often now. She was a quiet woman, not given to grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but she understood the people she'd raised. She knew David would overreach because he'd always been rewarded for it. She knew I would need backup because I'd always been the one expected to yield. And she built a legal fortress so subtle that neither of us saw it until the right moment. She played the long game better than any of us. All those afternoons I spent on the tractor while he was in Columbus closing deals, she was in the kitchen with a lawyer drawing a line in the sand that couldn't be erased. I still have her notebook. I look at it every day. So now, on a typical morning, I'll step outside with a cup of coffee and look across the field toward the farmhouse, where my brother is probably staring out the window at the little plaque with his case number, and I'll smile. He pays my bills now. He keeps up the property because the lease requires it, and if he doesn't, I can evict him and keep the restitution anyway. He is trapped in a cage made entirely of his own choices, and I am living peacefully in the home I was never supposed to have. The cottage is mine. The land is mine. The truth is mine. And every time he rakes a leaf or fixes a gutter, he's working for me and he knows it. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely, someone who was supposed to be family, and had to find the strength to protect what was rightfully yours? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories remind me that we are all capable of more toughness than the people who underestimate us can even dream of. And if this story gave you even a small spark of satisfaction, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We release new stories every week about the moments when quiet people start being quiet, and the reckoning that follows. Trust your gut, trust the ones who show up, and never let anyone make you feel small just because you're soft-spoken. I'll see you in the next one.